Hello, and welcome to And Still We Rise Uniting Women for Change, a podcast series by Churches for Middle East Peace, or CMEP. I'm your co host, Destiny Magnet, coming to you from Boston.
Alongside Tamar Haddad, sharing from Jerusalem. Each episode, we bring you the voices of American and Palestinian women as they share their stories and insights on peace building, spirituality, and current events, including the bombing of Gaza.
Get ready to explore the depths of the Palestinian struggle, learn about the forms and features of American solidarity, and draw inspiration from the unity and resilience of these incredible women.
Disclaimer: the views expressed are those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent CMEP.
This episode was recorded on February 2nd, 2024. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Uniting Women for Change and Still We Rise podcast. I'm Destiny Magnet, coming to you from Boston, and I am thrilled today to introduce our first guest, Eva Borgwardt. Eva is the national spokesperson for If Not Now, a movement of American Jews working to organize their communities to end U.S. support for Israel's system of apartheid and demand equality, justice, and a thriving future for Palestinians and Israelis. Eva is a graduate of Stanford University, and though I didn't realize it until I was doing research for this podcast, Eva and I are also both Truman Scholars, me Kansas 2021, and she Missouri 2019, which is a fun coincidence. It's such a small world. But Eva, welcome. We are so excited to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
And our second guest is a Palestinian. Her name is Eman Al-Asah. She's an academic based in the UK. She grew up in Bethlehem, Palestine, and is now doing her PhD in post-colonial studies at Northumbria Newcastle University. Her research focuses on identity politics and spatial liminalities in post-1993 Palestine. I went to Bethlehem University with Iman. Not only was she the top student in her class, she was also politically active on campus. Eman recently told me, "The Palestinian cause is my whole being. It gives me purpose."
When this podcast was initially imagined, it was before October 7th. And of course, for all of us here and for many of us in the world and in this work, October 7th has completely shifted our views of the world and our focus in our work and activism. And so I want to start off by asking both of you, what went through your mind on October 7th and how has it shifted your work? What are you doing to respond to it now?
Iman, go ahead.
I can't say that I wasn't shocked by October the 7th, but then after processing the shock, I felt that what we tried to tell the world after that this did not come from a political or historical vacuum. There is oppression. There has been a structure of oppression, of apartheid, of colonialism for a very, very long time. We're talking about over 7 decades of systematic and structural oppression towards the Palestinians. So the fact that the response to all of this was so violent and brutal was not particularly surprising because, colonization itself is a violent phenomenon, and therefore anti-colonial resistance is violent necessarily. I think what the 7th October did basically was to reintroduce the Palestinian cause to the world. For a very long time, the Palestinian cause was kind of swept under the rug. But on October the 7th, because it was Israelis that were the victims this time, because violence targeted Israeli civilians, that's when the world started to kind of prioritize the Palestinian cause, and the Palestinian cause started to resurface again and was a priority in international politics. And I think that's important because this is a struggle that has been going on for a very long time, that has been swept under the rug, but it's something that has to be confronted and addressed and solved, not just superficially, but from the roots. And that's basically through ending occupation and dismantling apartheid, which will be benefit to both Palestinians and Israelis. I mean, this is the only way. And I think the most reasonable response to October the 7th is to dismantle this regime of apartheid and for everyone from the river to the sea to live free and dignified.
Yeah, and Eva, what about you?
At the beginning of the day on October 7th, as we were waking up, we didn't fully understand what had happened. But there's a pattern in with the Israeli government in general and with Israeli responses to this kind of thing, where whenever a single Israeli is killed, we know that 10 times or exponentially the number of Palestinians are going to be killed by the Israeli government. And so, which in effect is the Israeli government taking away our right to grieve, Israelis, because we already have to start immediately mobilizing to prevent what we know will be a catastrophic and deadly response. And so we knew that this would be no different. And the October 7th attack was also much more personal for, even if not now, staff. We had staff who had loved ones who were killed on October 7th, people who were personally connected to hostages who were held in Gaza. And so we were mobilizing through intense and very personal grief, some of the grief that was sort of the most personal it had ever been. And as Eman said, this was happening to Israelis really for the first time at scale in this way, but this is not the first time for Palestinians. And in the initial days after October 7th, I was reaching out to Palestinian colleagues saying, we're trying to mobilize against the assault that was already underway almost immediately on Gaza. We're trying to mobilize through grief that is intensely personal, and I know that you know exactly what that is like. Additionally, for If Not Now, something that we were trying to do was both acknowledge and create space for the grief of our community and make clear, as Eman said, that this did not happen in a vacuum, and that obviously Hamas is responsible for their actions, and also the Israeli government is responsible for the arrogance and the deliberate choice to cage people indefinitely under occupation and apartheid, to brutalize them when they try to non-violently resist, and then to not expect disaster to happen to their own citizens. I mean, I have a colleague at If Not Now who used to work in the Israeli army. His job was to prepare the border communities near Gaza, mostly Mizrahi Jews, Arab Jews, for an attack that would come from Hamas. And that was happening way before October 7th. That was happening in the years prior, because there was a deliberate choice by the Israeli government to sacrifice their own citizens for the purposes of maintaining this indefinite regime of apartheid and siege on Gaza. And so, like Eman said, the thing that was shattered on October 7th was the idea that this status quo is somehow sustainable, and that there can be Israeli safety at the direct expense of Palestinian safety and freedom. And our task in mobilizing since then has been to hold our community's grief and horror, and also to show that the way out of this is not through military domination. It's through a ceasefire, a de-escalation, a hostage exchange, and through addressing the root causes of occupation and apartheid that have led us into this nightmare.
I have to say, you both come from very different backgrounds, but to see you both share similar ideas, and especially for young people and very articulate and very educated, to share something that you both agree on. So, Iman, for example, you were born into a Muslim family, and Eva, you were born into a Jewish one. Do you think religion plays a role in what is happening in the region right now? And what do you wish people understood better? Iman?
This is one of the things, the misconceptions that we have been trying to undo ever since October the 7th, and way before that, but like it resurfaced on October the 7th. And it's that this is not a religious issue. This is political, this is legal, this is colonial in a sense. So there are all of these aspects to it, but it's definitely not religious, in the sense that if Israel was predominantly Muslim or Christian, the response would have been the same, because this is a system of apartheid, a system of oppression. So Palestinians wouldn't have acted differently, for example, if Israel claimed that it's a Muslim country or like a Christian state or anything like that. Now, of course, religion, it's not completely out of the equation, because Israel claims that it is a Jewish state for Jews only. But we know very well, as many Jews do, that Israel is hijacking Jewish religion, Jewish legacy, and also Jewish history, because there's a long history of anti-Semitism, which is European in nature, by the way, historically speaking. So Israel is using all of this to kind of like justify its policies against the Palestinians. But the majority of the Palestinians, I would say, and the majority of those who stand in solidarity with Palestine know very well and can distinguish clearly between Zionism and Judaism. Unfortunately, we have to keep talking about that. We have to keep clarifying that this is not anti Semitic, this is not about Jewish religion, this is about the system itself. This is about Zionism as a political, as a colonial movement that is based on the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. So yeah, I mean there is a religious element to it, but it's not like a fundamental aspect to it. I think any solution has to be political and legal, and Palestine will have to be a secular democracy for everyone. Like this is the ideal solution, not a Jewish state, not an Islamic state. It has to be inclusive because Palestine has historically been multi-religious, multi-ethnic country. It's important to all religions. Historically, it has been a tapestry of religions and ethnicities, and that's how it should be, ideally. That's my stance on the religious aspect of it.
And that's why groups like If Not Now is very important, right, Eva?
Totally. I mean, really agree with Eman about the religious, the misconception that this is a deeply rooted religious conflict, which erases the imperialism, the power analysis, the geopolitics that have contributed to creating the status quo. The other erasure that takes place that I really want to lift up here is that is religious in nature is around Christian Zionism and how, especially for a country like the US, the US support for Israel is deeply, deeply rooted in a Christian Zionist vision for Israel. And if folks are not familiar, look up the Blackstone Memorial. It will blow your mind, which is a pamphlet by an evangelical Christian religious leader from 1891, which predates Theodore Herzl, and was endorsed by a lot of mainstream American political figures and news outlets, including the New York Times and all sorts of mainstream outlets, that was basically saying there needs to be a solution to the plight of the Russian Jews. They need to go somewhere. We certainly can't take them here. That would be expensive and horrible to take, millions of destitute Jewish refugees. And so perhaps they should go to Palestine. And from the beginning, there's been this deeply, deeply rooted and very popular vision that's grounded in these values of Christian Zionism that have backed US foreign policy, which again also is grounded in obviously predating the actual war on terror, but sort of an imperialist oriental vision for foreign policy and for the US role in the Middle East. So all of those factors are underlying this, in addition to the Jewish right-wing religious Zionism that, we're seeing take more and more of a hold in Israeli politics. Initially, Jewish Zionism was secular, but because of the religious and religious nature of what's also an ethno state, these far right religious forces have been able to take hold more and more and more in society. But we also we need to visibilize and talk about these other factors as well. And especially when, the defense that calling out Israeli action is anti-Semitic has been used for decades as a playbook from the Israeli government. What's underneath that is the argument that there's something inherently Jewish about endless occupation and military domination and apartheid, which is itself extremely anti-Semitic. And so that's part of why, as a Jewish movement, we need to vehemently reject that and say, this does not represent Jewish values. The actions of the Israeli government are not somehow inherently Jewish and don't lay claim to Jewish values or to Jewish liberation, and that there needs to be, vocal, active movements of Jews in the diaspora and also in Israel itself.
It was great, Eva. I would love to hear a little bit about your path to grassroots work, and where do you draw inspiration for this deep commitment to social justice that you bring to your work at If Not Now, and just embodying those values in your day-to-day life?
My path to activism initially ran through the Ferguson uprising after the murder of Michael Brown. And I was in St. Louis. I just graduated high school, and I was watching Black activists in the protests have holding signs in solidarity with Palestine and Palestinian freedom. And it was just the parallels were obvious to me. Black Americans were facing a militarized police force, and Palestinians in the West Bank were facing a military charged with policing. And so folks are trading tips on Twitter about how to deal with tear gas. And while I was watching this, I was also watching my Jewish community around me who had showed up to that protest in solidarity with Black activists in our city be super, super uncomfortable with the Palestine messaging. And it just became obvious to me that this issue was getting in the way of the Jewish community showing up for the civil rights struggles of our time. And, as I learned more and more, I learned that there have been millions, probably billions of dollars invested in American Jews having that reaction. And that there has been a clear investment and sort of an attempt to take over Jewish institutions and create Jewish institutions into an entire network in our community, that the goal of which is to invest in Jewish feelings of isolation, to exacerbate and stoke our trauma responses and racism and erasure of Palestinian people, and to create investment in the idea that the only way for Jews to be safe is through unconditional support for Israel and through, military domination of Palestinians, and that there's sort of a zero-sum equation between Jewish safety and Palestinian safety. And the converse of that, I think, is extremely powerful. If we're looking to undo this dynamic in the Jewish community that's been built over decades, we can pull from our own tradition. And that's what's sort of at the core of If Not Now. There's a quote from Rabbi Hillel, which is where our name comes from, that if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? What, not who, that dehumanizes you to only be for yourself. And if not now, when? And so the way to hold Jewish liberation together with the liberation of others is to take action in the present toward a more just world. And so the resources are right there. There's thousands of years of tradition that we can pull from, and that it's authentically about our liberation as well as Palestinian liberation. There's that great quote from Aboriginal activists in Australia that if you're here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you're here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together. And we need an engine that powerful where it's not about charity. It's about an authentic commitment to our own liberation and to the liberation of Palestinians and every other community. And that is what is driving our action every single day. And it's proven a really powerful core in this moment where our whole challenge is to endure through, the horror that is happening in Gaza and the horror being perpetuated by the Israeli government right now. And a really, really powerful source to draw from for that endurance is the understanding that this is also about our liberation as well.
This leads me to my next question. One of the most insightful conversations I had with Eman was on intersectionality and how people cannot defend, for example, Black lives or Jewish lives or Palestinian rights or women rights without standing in solidarity with Palestinian rights. What do you think about that, Iman?
Yeah, I think solidarity is not possible without intersectionality. This is the Palestinian struggle is an intersectional struggle, and I only came to understand like how important that is when I started to be politically active here in the West, in the UK. Because as you know, Tamar, it's very risky to be politically active in Palestine, in the West Bank or Gaza. So this is something that we have to be outside of Palestine to be able to do. And it occurred to me that the majority of activists here, like pro-Palestinian activists, and the majority of people who protest and march for Palestine are not Palestinians. They come from extremely diverse and different backgrounds, Jews, Muslims, Christians, queer people, feminists, all kinds of people from different political and ideological backgrounds. And this is because each of these people can kind of relate to the Palestinian struggle, partly because the oppression that Palestinians are subjected to is quite multi-layered and multi-structured. It's so intense that it resonates with so many different people who are oppressed, but in different ways. One example is that you cannot. It's hard to be a feminist without defending Palestinian women. You see now in Gaza, women are going through so much, childbirth, menstruation, even domestic violence and other sorts of oppression without any help, without any support. So it's not possible to defend feminism and women's rights without looking at what the circumstances of Palestinian women. The same goes to, LGBTQ communities, class struggle, and all of that. So I think the Palestinian cause resonates with a lot of people. Of course, there are other people who just empathize and sympathize with the Palestinians, and I think that's what makes us humans, right? Like we empathize, we feel the pain of others, and that's really important. I mean, here I have to remember one of the most iconic quotes by one of the most prominent Palestinian authors, Ghassan Kanafani, who actually said that the Palestinian cause is not for Palestinians only, it is the cause of all oppressed masses. And I think that's why we see like the most vocal activists for Palestine come from, oppressed minorities or communities, including Jews, with this long history of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish racism, Black people, women, feminists. And it's no coincidence that it was South Africa that prosecuted Israel just last month at the ICJ, because they know what it is like to be, a person of color under apartheid regime. So I think Palestine is an example that embodies what intersectionality, what intersectional solidarity is. And as activists, we see that every day. We see it in our political engagement.
Yeah, and Eva, for you too, I know intersectionality is very important to your work, and I would love to hear your comments on this question.
Everything Iman said, that there are so many activists on the Jewish left who really understand the Palestinian struggle, as they see and feel the parallels in their bones. And whether it's thinking about the Nakba and the expulsion of Jews from different countries, especially in Europe, or what's happening now, and entire families being wiped out, and like I deeply resonate with that on a personal level. I know that, there were hundreds of people with my last name who were wiped out generations before I was born, and I see that happening to Palestinians today. And so for some of us, it's obvious, and for some in the Jewish community, it's deeply not obvious. And in this moment, there's what I like to call the Thunderdome of two different versions of Jewish safety, of how Jewish safety is secured, that are kind of battling it out in sort of the most dramatic terms that we've ever seen. Is our safety secured through military domination, through allying with empire and state power, in all of these different ways? Or is Jewish safety dependent on safety of everyone else? And October 7th is sort of itself is the most dramatic version of that breakdown, that you cannot secure Jewish safety at the expense of Palestinian safety. But there are other ways in which that breakdown is deeply, deeply obvious and painful. And I think a couple of them, for example, are President Biden proposing to send billions of dollars in US weapons funding and refusing to call for a ceasefire. And in doing so, in going against 70% of the Democratic base, he is risking throwing the next election to Donald Trump, which would jeopardize the safety of every Jewish person, every Palestinian person, every marginalized person in the United States. And so, how can we say that that is somehow for Jewish safety? And it's in some ways calling the bluff of this idea that unconditional military support for Israel is backing Jewish safety. And as soon as you zoom out and are aware of the ways in which Jewish safety is tied together with the safety of everyone else, including, Jews and Palestinians who possess all sorts of identities that would be jeopardized under a white supremacist regime of the type that Donald Trump embodies, we also see this with AIPAC's actions, where in the last election, they backed 109 insurrectionist Republicans who wanted to overthrow the results of the 2020 election. And they're also one of the major forces undermining progressives who are advocating for a Green New Deal, Medicare for all, education reform, racial justice, all of these things. And again, like this is what happens when, you're arguing that the way to secure Jewish safety is through unconditional support for Israel. You're actually undermining like the safety of not only Jews and every single other group. And then you have queer Jews, Black Jews, Jews of color, disabled Jews, like all sorts of people whose any person who's, who needs a Green New Deal and who is going to suffer under the devastating climate conditions that are already here, and that all of our futures are being undermined by this singular vision of Jewish safety at the expense of safety for other people. And we're seeing that play out in the most dramatic way it ever has. And so, in this horrific moment, that's one thing that provides a lot of potential, is people being able to unite together with everyone else and say, we won't be divided from each other. Our liberation is tied together, and we're doing everything we can to stop this.
Yeah, that reminds me so much. And also being aware that this is being recorded, on the second day of Black History Month in the US, of Audre Lorde's There Is No Hierarchy of Oppression, where she says, I cannot afford the luxury of fighting one form of oppression only. I cannot afford to believe that freedom from intolerance is the right of only one particular group. And I cannot afford to choose between the fronts upon which I must battle these forces of discrimination, wherever they appear to destroy me. And when they appear to destroy me, it will be not long before they appear to destroy you. And so that was just going through my head as both of you were answering that question. And I think this is so important and really the core of what this podcast is about and what our programming for And Still We Rise, of course, the Maya Angelou poem inspiring that, is about at the same time.
And I do hear the passion in both your voices, and I see them intersect at one point. And this makes me think, like, do you see things changing after October 7th? Do you see it in a hopeful way? Are there possible solutions to this problem? Because honestly, before October 7th, I couldn't see us, as Palestinians having our own peace. But I feel like now things are moving forward a little bit and things are changing. Like settler violence is being criminalized. Now everybody is like trying to find a solution to the problem, the Palestinian Israeli problem. What do you think about that? Do you see it happening now more than before, Iman?
Generally, I'm not a very optimistic person because we have been struggling for a very long time and we have been left alone. The world has been watching Palestinians being ethnically cleansed, being oppressed, and has not done anything to prevent that. However, I think this is a just cause of liberation. We know from history that no colonization stays forever, no apartheid stays forever. These systems of oppression are not sustainable, as Eva has said. So we know that they will end at some point, and justice and freedom will prevail. This is inevitable. It will take time. It has taken 7 decades, and it might take more decades. But I believe in the Palestinian steadfastness and this continuous struggle for justice and liberation, and then, of course, peace. What has been happening in the past few years, the legal developments and the political developments on an international level, especially the fact that Israel now is recognized by so many countries as an apartheid regime, the fact that recently the ICJ has prosecuted Israel for genocide, or at least that this was acknowledged. It's a possibility that Israel is committing genocide. These are all developments that, although they do not have any effect on the ground at the moment, we have to remember that as we're speaking now, people in Gaza are being bombed. People are being displaced. People are living in tents, hungry and cold and thirsty. We have to understand that it's not changing anything on the ground right now, not even in the West Bank, because settler violence is still a real threat. Military checkpoints are all over the West Bank, settlements are expanding, etc. So it's not changing much. The change is very slow, and it will be very slow to register in real life, but it's a good start. And I think that's the consequence of solidarity movements, of boycott movements, of political activism, and this very long history of struggle against apartheid and colonialism. So, yeah, I'm not very optimistic, but I think that we are in the right way, and that, freedom and justice will prevail at the end, because, again, systems of oppression are not sustainable. And the sooner Israeli leadership and the international community recognizes that, the sooner we will have peace in the region.
And to Eva,
Everything in this moment feels bigger and on a more dramatic scale. The horror is exacerbated and more horrific than it's ever been. I think the hope and the sort of seeds of change that we've seen, particularly in the American political system, are also I think there's more optimism there than there's ever been. Our movements are mobilizing at a scale that is, more dramatic and effective than it's ever been. And things could also get worse than they have ever been. I mean, we just saw this, resettlement conference happen in Jerusalem, and there's, entrenching Israeli control over the West Bank. And I think there's real, genuine reasons to fear that things will get dramatically worse before they get better. And I hope that Eman is right. And I think that's true that, we've seen empires fall and oppression at this scale can't last forever. And I think there's genuine reason to fear about things getting worse. And we have to, if not celebrate, at least lift up and take hope from the success that our movements have had and the changes that we are seeing in especially the US and international political systems, because these movements have won enormous gains in terms of the fact that conditioning US military aid to Israel is a real conversation that's extremely widespread in the US Congress right now. And obviously the ICJ ruling that there is plausible genocide happening. We're seeing sort of these cracks in what was previously almost ironclad US and international backing of the Israeli regime. And the movement for ceasefire and beyond, ceasefire and all that that represents, ceasefire, hostage exchange, de-escalation, end the siege, and address these root causes of occupation and apartheid. I think the biggest weapon that the opposition has against our movement right now is our despair and our fatigue and our feeling that we're not getting anywhere. And, this constant barrage of horror that we're still seeing on our screens, that we're still seeing live streamed from Gaza, and feeling that, nothing that we're doing is working. It is working. And it's just going extremely excruciatingly slowly, and there's so far to go, but we have to take some kind of hope and encouragement from the cracks that we are seeing, because the most essential thing right now is to keep going and to draw strength from where we can and not stop or not succumb to despair or feelings of failure, because that is the main thing that they have against this otherwise extremely successful movement right now.
Thank you so much. We have just a few minutes left, and so I have one final question for both of you. We are nearing March, which is Women's History Month and also International Women's Day. And along those lines, if you could say something, a piece of advice, a piece of encouragement to young activists, especially young women activists who are listening to this, what would you leave them with? And so we'll start with Eva for this question.
Well, I think something that's been amazing about this movement so far is that we're really seeing a revival of the anti-war movement in the US, which also feels like our generation's feminism. And it's an anti-genocide feminism, it's an anti-imperial, anti-war feminism. We're seeing intersectionality and integration of all of the different struggles of, what's the Green New Deal for foreign policy? What does it look like to have a just U.S. role in the world? And at the front lines of these protests and of this organizing are young Palestinian, Jewish, and Black women and queer people, which has been, really, really inspiring. And I think this is really a moment for our leadership. And I think in terms of advice, I think I would say reaching for relationships and knowing that our relationships and our connection is a huge source of our power. And also just, finding both your stake, the way in which your liberation is tied up in this struggle, that will be the engine that can keep going for the long haul. And also unique contributions. We're seeing this in this wave, I would say, since January. We're seeing teachers unions, we're seeing all sorts of unions, we're seeing city councils, we're seeing boards of education, companies, all sorts of new actors who are saying, like, actually, we're passing resolutions for a ceasefire. This is our struggle too. And so really encouraging folks to be like, what are your communities? Where do you have access? Where can you organize people? And it might be way closer to home than you think. You might have a city council resolution that's happening in your city. You might have a workplace you can organize. And so really having folks, find their power close to home and lean into relationships. And that's how we'll build the solidarity and power that we need to win this, both in the short term and in the much longer term.
Thanks so much. And shout out to my city council, Somerville, Massachusetts, that did pass a ceasefire resolution last week. And then Eman, we'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I think what I want to emphasize or highlight is that sometimes it feels like we're alone. Sometimes it feels, depressing and disappointing. But we have to remember that we're not alone in this. Every time I go to marches or to protests and I see these thousands and sometimes millions of people marching for a free Palestine, it gives me hope. It gives me hope that I'm not alone in this, that this is a collective struggle, this is a movement of solidarity for a just cause, a cause of liberation and freedom. So I think I want to emphasize what Palestinians are asking us to do, what Palestinians in Palestine want us to tell the world, which is basically to keep mobilizing urgently for a ceasefire, but also to keep going for a free Palestine, for whether it's a one state or two state solution, but any kind of solution, a political solution, not a military solution, that would ensure the freedom and justice for Palestinians and for Israelis. And the aim eventually is to find a way to coexist, to live together in a democratic and inclusive way. And although it's hard, it's a long struggle, but we have to keep going because there's no other choice. We don't have any other choice. We don't have the privilege not to keep going. So I think that's my message to people listening to the podcast.
Thank you both for being with us today. I think your messages were really powerful, and I'm sure you inspire not only young activists but young women as well.
Yeah, I completely echo that. Thank you so much for being with us. This has been a really, really powerful conversation.
Thanks so much, y'all.
Thank you very much.
We started recording the Uniting Women for Change podcast right after October 7th. We tried our best to have timeless content. Even though the focus was on Gaza, in the beginning we thought and hoped that the war would be over by the time all episodes were published.
As of today, the 2nd of February, the war is still taking innocent lives. This podcast is a reminder for you to stay engaged when it comes to human rights. We thank everyone who went on protests, donated, called their representatives, and is continuing to be an active participant and making change in your own way and in your own community. Thank you for listening to And Still We Rise, Uniting Women for Change. Together, Palestinian and American women can make a difference. I'm your co-host, Destiny Magnet, signing off from Boston.
And I'm Tamar Haddad, signing off from Jerusalem. For more information on Churches for Middle East Peace and our work, visit cmap.org. Here, you can find the latest news from the region, opportunities to get involved, and resources for contacting U.S. representatives about our core issues. See you next time!